The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet sold America its happiest family for 14 years. The cameras stopped in 1966, and the real lives kept going. 12 of the 13 faces you remember are gone now. One boarded a New Year's Eve flight and never came home. Here is everyone. Number 1. He studied law at Rutgers, and he used that training to corner a young television network into the first guaranteed contract the business had ever seen, a deal that could never be canceled. Oswald Nelson made certain his family would be paid for 10 full years whether a single episode aired or not. And then he ran every inch of the operation himself, writing, producing, directing, and cutting all 435 episodes. For the audience, he was the gentle father in the cardigan who never seemed to hold a job in his life. Off camera, he was one of the hardest and most calculating operators that early television ever produced. He married the band singer Harriet Hilliard in 1935, and the union lasted 40 years, in large part because the marriage and the company were the same living thing, the home and the family and the business impossible to pull apart. Liver cancer found him in the spring of 1975, and it took him on the 3rd of June at the age of 69. He died inside the house at 1822, Camino Palmero, the same Hollywood home whose exterior opened every episode, so that the most filmed house in America became the quiet room where its owner finally let go. His grave rests at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, on a slope near Ascension Road, in the plot that would later receive Harriet and their younger son. Ozzie Nelson sold a nation a father with nothing to do. The man who created him never stopped working for a single day. Second, she buried her husband, and then she buried her son, and she carried both losses across 19 long years. As the last survivor of the family the country believed nothing could touch. On screen, she was the unflappable mother at the center of the house, the steady figure every story came home to. Born Peggy Lou Snyder in Des Moines, she became Harriet Hilliard on stage, a dancer and band vocalist who once shared a film with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Her first marriage, to a man named Roy Sedley in 1930, was annulled within 3 years and seldom mentioned again. She found her real life in 1935 with Ozzie Nelson, and the two stayed married for 4 decades, until cancer took him in 1975 and left her a widow at 65. The harder blow arrived 10 years later. On the final night of 1985, her younger son died in a burning plane, and Harriet learned of it the way strangers did, watching the news alone in her own living room. Work continued in small ways into the late 1980s, yet the actress who had played the unshakable mother spent her last decade as a parent who had outlived her child. Congestive heart failure ended her life on the 2nd of October 1994 in Laguna Beach at the age of 85. Her body was carried up to Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills and set between her husband and the son she had lost. The three of them returned to the same slope. Harriet Nelson was written as the calm that held a family together. In life, she became the one force to outlast every member of it. Number 3. The show simply let him go. After 5 seasons as the friendly face over the fence, Don DeFore was written out while the series rolled on for 9 more years without him, the neighbor America knew vanishing from a home that kept its lights on. He was the genial, competitive man next door, one of television's earliest pictures of the good neighbor. DeFore did the most sensible thing a discarded actor could do, which was to walk straight into a bigger role. By 1961, he was starring as the exasperated employer of the housekeeper Hazel, and that part made him more famous than the Nelsons ever had. His private life was its own quiet success. He married Marion Holmes in 1942 and stayed with her for the rest of his days, and together they drew the plans for a farmhouse in Mandeville Canyon, where she finished the interiors and he built much of the furniture by hand. One of their sons, Ron, grew up to work in the Reagan administration, and DeFore himself, a lifelong Republican, sat on a presidential advisory council for the Peace Corps. Cardiac arrest took him on the 22nd of December 1993 at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, 3 days before Christmas, at the age of 80. His body was cremated and placed at Westwood Village Memorial Park, the same small cemetery where the elder Nelson's son would one day come to rest. Don DeFore played the man who lived next door. He came to rest beside the family's own son, far from the parents who anchored the show. The fourth name. She married into the most wholesome family in America at the age of 17, and she spent the rest of her life, in her own words, fighting the fairy tale, first trying to be it, and then trying to tell the truth about it. Kristin Harmon joined the cast as Rick's real wife, the bright young bride folded into the Nelson household. She was the daughter of a Heisman Trophy winner and the sister of the actor Mark Harmon, and she was barely out of girlhood when she stepped into the spotlight in 1963. The marriage gave her 4 children, including the twin sons who would later form their own band. Those years inside the fairy tale were far harder than the cameras showed. She spoke openly, long afterward, about the drinking and the drug use that shadowed those years, and about a divorce in 1982 so bitter and expensive that it helped ruin the man she had married. For a time, she supported herself as an assistant casting director, painting whenever she could, rebuilding a life out of the wreckage of a myth. A second marriage, to a television director, lasted 12 years before it ended as well. She found her steadiest footing as an artist, exhibiting her paintings and writing about the life she had lived. A heart attack took her on the 27th of April 2018 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at the age of 72, far from Hollywood and the family that had once defined her. No public record names where she was laid to rest. Kristin Harmon was cast as the perfect young wife in the perfect young family. She told the world before she went that the fairy tale had nearly cost her everything. Number 5. Before he ever stood in front of a camera, he ran away to the circus and made his living as a ringmaster, cracking the whip for Barnum and Bailey and handling animals at a wild animal park in the California hills. Parley Baer was the fussy, officious neighbor named Darby, the balding stickler he played so well across the late 50s. The circus was only the first surprise in a life full of them. During the Second World War, he served as a captain in the Army Air Forces in the Pacific. And on the radio, he originated the role of Chester in the first version of Gunsmoke, opposite a marshal listeners could only imagine. His face and voice were everywhere once television took hold. He played the mayor of Mayberry on the Andy Griffith Show. He turned up in To Kill a Mockingbird. And for years he was the voice of the little elf who baked the cookies in the Keebler advertisements. In 1946, he married an aerialist and bareback writer named Ernestine Clark, a woman who had spent her own life under the big top, and they stayed together until her death in 2000, raising 2 daughters along the way. A stroke struck him on the 11th of November, 2002, and he was taken to the Motion Picture and Television Hospital in Woodland Hills, where he died 11 days later at the age of 88. He was buried at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills, on the same grounds that already held Ozzie, Harriet, and Rick Nelson, the neighbor settling near the family one last time. Parley Baer spent his career playing small men who guarded the rules. The real one was a war captain who had once run away with the circus. 6. On the 15th of October, 1971, he walked onto the stage at Madison Square Garden in a velvet shirt with his hair grown long, and somewhere in his newer songs the crowd began to boo. Rick Nelson had been the irrepressible younger son whose guitar turned a family sitcom into a music career. The booing cut so deep that he left the stage and skipped the finale, and then he did the bravest thing of his career. He went home and wrote a song about the humiliation, a defiant tune called Garden Party built around the idea that a man has to please himself, and it rose to number 6 and became the last great hit of his life. The money did not last. His divorce from Kristin Harmon, finalized at the end of 1982 after years of bitterness, drained more than $1 million and left a former teen idol nearly broke. He kept touring to stay afloat, engaged by then to a woman named Helen Blair, moving his band by an old Douglas DC-3 built in 1944. On the final day of 1985, the heater in that aging plane caught fire over Texas, and the cabin filled with smoke near the town of DeKalb. 7 of the 9 people aboard died, Rick and Helen among them, along with 5 of his musicians, while the 2 pilots escaped alive. His mother heard the news on television at home. The last song he ever sang, the night before, was Buddy Holly's Rave On, the very song Holly performed before his own plane went down. Rick Nelson rests at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills, in the Revelation section, plot 3540, a few rows from the parents who made him a star. The country met him as a boy who had everything handed to him. He died at 45 and nearly penniless on a burning plane, singing the same farewell as the man whose death once shook him. If one story here is going to stay with you tonight, it is probably that one. Tell me in the comments where you were when you first heard that Rick Nelson was gone. Number 7. His story begins with a loss almost too cruel to be true. 3 months after he was born in Pittsburgh, his mother died of typhoid fever, and the infant was handed to his grandmother in Nebraska, who legally changed his surname to her own and raised him alone. Lyle Talbot played Ozzie's friend and neighbor Joe Randolph, a steady comic foil for roughly 10 years of the run. He left home at 17 to work as a hypnotist's assistant in traveling tent shows, drifted into stock theater, and finally signed with Warner Brothers in 1931. The choice that defined him came in the mid-1930s, when he became one of the founding members of the Screen Actors Guild and took a seat on its very first board. That stand angered the studio bosses and pushed him out of leading roles, yet he never once complained, saying years later that he had never turned down a job in his life and never wanted for work. His personal life ran through 5 marriages before it settled. The 5th, to a woman called Paula, began in 1948 and lasted until her death in 1989. And it gave him 4 children, 3 of whom built careers in journalism and broadcasting, with his daughter Margaret eventually writing his biography. He went on appearing in films into old age, including several of the cheap, strange pictures directed by Ed Wood. Congestive heart failure took him on the 2nd of March 1996 at his home in San Francisco, at the remarkable age of 94, the last surviving founder of the Actors Union he had helped create. His final resting place was never recorded in any public account. Lyle Talbot spent his life playing forgettable men in forgettable films. History remembers him as the man who helped give every actor after him a union. The 8th. She spent her career making audiences laugh, and she did it while carrying a grief most of them never knew because her only son was killed in the Vietnam War. Mary Jane Croft played the bright, high-voiced neighbor Clara, the chatty woman married to Ozzie's friend Joe. Long before television, she was one of the most reliable voices in radio drama, working steadily after moving to Los Angeles in 1939. She became a fixture of 2 worlds at once, playing Clara for the Nelsons while turning up again and again beside Lucille Ball, first as a neighbor on the original Lucy series, and later in 2 more of Ball's shows. Her first marriage gave her that one son, Eric. She later married the producer and director Elliot Lewis in 1959, and she stayed with him until his death around 1990, after which she stepped away from performing for good. The loss of her boy in Vietnam was the wound she carried quietly behind every comic part. When she died of natural causes on the 24th of August, 1999, in Century City, at the age of 83, the actress Lucy Arnaz remembered her as the warm and joyful opposite of the silly women she so often played. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered at sea, leaving no headstone and no plot, only open water. Mary Jane Croft made a living being funny for other people. She did it while privately mourning a child the country had sent to war and never sent home. If you want every one of these stories as they arrive, follow the channel and stay with us. There are 4 more lives to account for before we are done. Number 9. She tasted real fame and decided she wanted no part of it. June Blair had been a rising film actress and a magazine cover model when she married David Nelson, joined the family's show as his on-screen wife, and then, by most accounts, quietly chose to leave the spotlight for good. She played June Nelson, David's wife, in the show's later seasons. A real marriage slipped into the cast the same way Rick's had been. Raised by accounts of the era in a series of households that were not her own, she had clawed her way into pictures through the 1950s, appearing in film noir and studio dramas before the Nelsons. The marriage to David, begun in 1961, gave her 2 sons before it ended in divorce in 1975, and friends later said she had little love for public life and may well have been the one to end it. Once the cameras were gone, she disappeared into an ordinary existence and stayed there. She lived nearly 5 more decades in quiet, and when she died of natural causes on the 4th of December, 2022, at her home in Sherman Oaks, she was 90 years old, the last of the show's central wives to go. Her niece, the actress Tracy Nelson, called her sweet and gorgeous in announcing the loss. Where she was laid to rest has not been made public. June Blair held real fame in her hands and let it go. She traded the camera for a long private life and never once looked back. 10. His family found him dead in his own home, 3 days after his 63rd birthday, a man who had once been a child star and ended his life largely out of view. Skip Young played Wally Plumstead, the lovable, scheme-prone friend whom the Nelson boys were forever rescuing from trouble. He had started in the business at the age of 4, appeared in a pair of short films in 1934, and served in the Navy during the Korean War before acting claimed him for good. When the producers needed a last name for his character, he handed them his own, so the made-up friend on screen carried the real surname Plumstead, the name of the family he was born into. Steady work grew scarce after the series ended, and he drifted into other things, hosting a radio show and judging beauty contests in his later years. Diabetes had troubled him for a long time, and on the 17th of March 1993, it contributed to the heart attack that killed him at his home in Apple Valley, where his relatives discovered him. Because he had served his country, he was buried with military honors at Riverside National Cemetery, among rows of other veterans. Skip Young gave his own family name to a character millions came to love. He was laid to rest as a sailor, under a stone that says nothing about Wally at all. The 11th. His entire career began with a game of touch football, on a field where the two team captains happened to be Rick Nelson and Elvis Presley. Kent McCord, born Kent Franklin McWhirter, was a college student dreaming of becoming a coach when that game made him a friend of Rick's and pulled him into the family show. On the series, he played one of Rick's fraternity brothers, a young face in a handful of college scenes. His first spoken line on screen was 2 small words, "Rick who?" that he says changed his life. The friendship led to a contract, the contract led to bigger work, and in 1968, a producer cast him as Officer Jim Reed on Adam 12, the role that made him a household name for 7 seasons. Away from the screen, he gave decades to the Screen Actors Guild, serving as a vice president and chairing the committee that shaped protections for child performers, and he once ran for the union's presidency. He married Cynthia Lee Doty in 1962 and built a long family life around her and their 3 children. Acting carried him into the new century through science fiction series and films before he stepped back from the camera. Today, at the age of 83, he is still living in Los Angeles, the last surviving member of the Adam 12 cast and one of the final living links to the Nelson household. Kent McCord owes his whole career to a pickup football game and 2 words spoken to a friend. He is the one face from this story still here to tell it. The last of the 12 is the brother who outlived them all and who made one quiet, startling decision at the end. Offered a place in the family plot beside his parents and his brother, David Nelson said no. He had been the steadier elder son, the responsible counterweight to Rick's mischief in the Nelson home. Raised entirely inside the act, he attended Hollywood High and the University of Southern California, and even trained as a trapeze artist for a film role. He once admitted what the perfect family cost in private, describing how the household would drop a real argument the instant an outsider walked in, as though a director had called action. His first marriage to June Blair brought 2 sons and ended in divorce in 1975. The same year he married Yvonne Houston and adopted her 3 children, a union that held until his death. Behind the camera, he built a real career as a director and producer, the craftsman of the family rather than its star. When colon cancer took him on the 11th of January 2011 in Century City, at the age of 74, he became the last of the 4 central Nelsons to die. And then came the choice. Rather than join Ozzie, Harriet, and Rick at Forest Lawn, he asked to be cremated and placed in a niche at Westwood Village Memorial Park, a separate cemetery across the city, apart from the family he had performed beside his whole life. David Nelson spent his youth selling the picture of a family that could never be divided. In death, he chose, gently and deliberately, to rest alone. They are scattered now across California, a hillside at Forest Lawn, a niche in Westwood, a soldier's grave at Riverside, and a stretch of sea that keeps no marker.